Thank you. Every day we walk through cities, but rarely do we ever ask ourselves, who planned this? How did this messy mix of buildings and people and infrastructure come to be? The answer to that question used to be relatively straightforward. It came from a man with a vision. A planner would look at a public space and he would determine the best use of that space, and then he would tell the public. Now, we're all familiar with spaces created by these men of vision. We have Pierre L'Enfant's Washington, D.C., we have Lucio Costa's Brasilia, and we have Walt Disney's Tomorrowland. But the problem with public space is that the public keeps insisting on using it. So, for every famous man who envisions a pedestrian mall lined with monuments celebrating democracy, you have another somewhat less famous man who looks at that exact same space and says, this would be a perfect place to sell t-shirts. Now, the reason for that is that cities are places that people live in, and they're constantly adapting and changing and creating a city to fit their needs, not the needs of a planner. Okay. And in fact, I would argue that the best public spaces are ones where people are constantly recreating the space to fit their needs. If it isn't, it's not a very well-designed public space. When planners really realized this, they started changing the planning process, and they started pulling people in to the process, pulling the public in. And in a uniquely ironic twist, they gave it a name that no member of the public understands. They called it a charrette, which is apparently French for people sitting around drawing on maps. And that's exactly what happens. The planner opens his doors to the public. They come in, they sit at tables, they draw on maps, they make lists. And ideally, all of the best ideas should rise to the top. And at the end, you should have a public space that people use because they were part of the planning process. I've been involved in more of these than I can count, these charrettes. And regardless of the city, regardless of the area within the city, it's always the same list. People want artist studios. They want public art. They want galleries. They want a farmer's market. And they also want a grocery store. Loft apartments are always on the list, as is green space. Everybody wants a park. So the planner takes this list and he puts it all together in a formal plan, and he adds some lovely sketches of the streetscape with 40-year-old trees along the sidewalk and fashionable people sitting at sidewalk cafes. And he puts it all in a binder and he gives it to the community and says, here is your publicly generated plan. And the community says, thank you. And they take it and they put it on a shelf, and that's where it usually stays. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, and sometimes it's because these plans are little more than the community's wish list. Market forces are ignored, supply and demand are glossed over, and funding sources are just non-existent. Our time might have been better spent writing letters to Santa on what we wanted for Christmas. The other reason is that this just isn't how cities are planned. Cities aren't made this way. Cities are messy and they're alive, and half the time planners are really trying to struggle to keep up with what's happening naturally all around them. So it doesn't always work. And in fact, I would say that great cities are made from the bottom up, not the top down. Think New York City, not Irvine, California. Sorry, Orange County folks. And in fact, in great cities, a random encounter that happens on the sidewalk can do more to change the urban fabric than can a formal plan. And so, when planners realize this, what they do is they begin to question themselves. How does these random encounters work? Well, author Stephen Johnson, talks about these random encounters in terms of a swerve. Now, what does that mean? Every day, we have set routes that we travel through the city. The path between my office and the local coffee shop is well worn, okay? But the thing is, we will veer off those paths if there is something interesting. So a new shop, a sidewalk cafe, an art installation, and we'll swerve. And so will everyone else, until enough people swerve and this little bubble becomes incorporated into the whole. Well, then the next guy comes along and he says, I'm going to open a business. There's so much traffic there. And he opens something, but it's right outside that bubble. And it's usually because that's where the vacancy rates are low. That's where the rental rates are low. That's where the vacancy rates are high. So he opens a business and more people swerve. And then the next person comes along and she goes, I'm going to open a restaurant there. And so she opens something and more people swerve. And then pretty soon you have a bustling urban street where there wasn't one before. And that's how it works. And you ask yourself, who planned this area? Well, no one and everyone. There's no leader. There was a multitude of individual decisions that people made on how best to take advantage of the swerve. And together, these look like a plan, but they're not. You might as well ask who planned the web. Well, no one and everyone. Google can give you a directory to the web, but that's like calling the phone book an urban planning document. It's all based on the swerve. Okay, so in light of that, what becomes the role of a planner? How do we then plan cities if they are truly bottom up? Well, part of the role of a planner is to really adapt to what's happening naturally on the street level. And that's what planning becomes. One thing a lot of us are talking about on a nationwide level is something called naturally occurring arts districts. Now, these are areas that are created naturally, organically, from existing cultural assets. Nobody plans them. They grow based on the swerve. And we have one here. It's called the North Village Arts District. Now, I'd say 7 or 8 years ago, my organization looked at a map of the North Village and we said, this would make a great arts district. And it was utter hubris. We had no plan, we had no funding, we had no marketing campaign. But what we had was what we thought was a great existing base of cultural assets. The North Village had long been known as the bohemian section of downtown. There was a lot of funky little shops in the area. Susan Taylor Glasgow, a locally known and nationally known artist in her own right, was doing some really interesting things with public art in the neighborhood. And then, of course, there's Mojo. So there's a steady stream of live music. So we looked at this and said, let's start recruiting arts-oriented businesses to this area. And that's what we started doing. And then one day, Mark Timberlake walks into my office. And he said, so I bought a roofing company on Orr Street. What should I do with it? Now, I had been fielding calls for months from artists looking for studio space, and I had nowhere to send them, so I did not hesitate when I said, you need to build artist studios. And to my surprise, he listened. But more importantly, he talked to people. He talked to artists. He talked to contractors. He learned about adaptive reuse and how you change one thing into something else. And pretty soon, Orr Street Studios was born. Artists moved in, opened studios, they hung paintings, they had gallery openings, and Chris Teeter turned the doors themselves into works of art. And people started to swerve, so much so that he bought the buildings next door and started the whole process all over again. Well, John Ott bought some properties, and he started recruiting artists as well. Lisa Bartlett opened Artlandish Gallery, and she runs a Catacombs, which we've heard about. It's a collection of artists in a warren of tunnels underneath her shop. She did this and more people started to swerve. And then we started working with the city to improve the infrastructure in the area. We undergrounded utility lines, we put in streetlights, added crosswalks and bike racks, hung banners, all in an effort to get people to swerve. And they did. People started moving in, photographers and dance companies and graphic artists and web developers, because that's where the creativity was. And then Mojo's expanded, and they built Forest Rose Park. And then one day, Cafe Berlin packed their entire restaurant into a caravan of bikes and moved into the gas station of all places. More swerve. Things were happening in this area. And then we learned that PS Gallery, a well-established gallery on Broadway, had to relocate. And the first question everyone asked was, are you moving to the North Village Arts District? Well, the answer was yes. Swerve. So now you walk through the arts district, and yes, we have a farmer's market. We have a grocery store as well. We have galleries. We have public art. We have a park. We have loft apartments, and there's more on the way. And we have all these things not because someone sitting alone said, I envision the neighborhood in exactly this way. We have this neighborhood because all of us, artists, business owners, property owners, got together and made individual decisions on how best to take advantage of the Swerve. So we asked the question again, who planned the North Village Arts District? Well, the answer is everyone and no one. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.